It started with a sentence that sounded bold in the moment, confident, even righteous, and then aged faster than almost anything WNBA media has ever put on air. At a time when the league was finally breaking through to a wider audience, when arenas were full and eyes were glued to screens in ways they hadn't been before, Elle Duncan went on ESPN and suggested something that stopped a lot of people cold. She argued that the sudden wave of new fans wasn't helping the WNBA grow. According to her, they were draining it, sucking the life out of it. It was said casually, almost dismissively, but the implication was huge. Growth, at the very moment it arrived, was being framed as a problem. What makes that take so jarring in hindsight is the timing. This wasn't a slow, uncertain rise. This was the peak of the Caitlin Clark effect. The league wasn't just doing well, it was experiencing attention it had chased for decades. Sellouts weren't isolated events anymore. Ratings weren't flukes. Major sports shows weren't squeezing the WNBA into a quick mention before commercial. They were leading with it. For the first time in a long time, women's basketball wasn't asking to be seen. It was being watched. And right in the middle of that moment, the message went out that the fans responsible for it might actually be hurting the league. Fast forward to now, and that comment doesn't just sound wrong, it sounds disastrous. The WNBA is dealing with sliding viewership, rising labor tension, and a fan base that feels noticeably more distant than it did a year ago. The buzz that once felt unstoppable has cooled. The optimism has been replaced by arguments, blame, and second-guessing. Even voices that once echoed similar sentiments are starting to change their tone. That's what makes this moment unavoidable. Because when the excitement fades and the numbers slip, people don't forget the warnings they were given, especially when those warnings came from the same people now wondering what went wrong. So this isn't really about one comment or one segment. It's about how quickly confidence can turn into embarrassment when reality steps in. A sentence meant to protect the league ended up exposing a deeper issue, a discomfort with growth that didn't arrive on familiar terms. And as the consequences stack up, a question keeps resurfacing that nobody in WNBA media wants to answer directly. When a take collapses this completely, when the opposite of what was predicted starts happening in real time, does accountability matter? Or does everyone just pretend that sentence was never said at all? The idea that growth itself could be dangerous didn't come out of nowhere, but the way it was framed caught people off guard. When Elle Duncan spoke about new fans sucking the life out of the league, it wasn't delivered as a joke or throwaway line. It was positioned as insight, as if something harmful was happening beneath the surface of all that attention. The problem wasn't that the league was growing, she implied, but how it was growing and who was responsible for that growth. Instead of celebration, there was suspicion. Instead of momentum, there was caution. What made that framing so striking is that it flipped the usual sports narrative completely upside down. Most leagues dream of sudden relevance. They chase stars. They spend millions trying to manufacture the exact kind of buzz the WNBA had landed organically. But in this moment, visibility wasn't treated like a breakthrough. It was treated like an intrusion. New viewers weren't welcomed as reinforcements. They were talked about like outsiders who didn't get it, as if their presence cheapened what the league had built. The message came across clearly, even if it wasn't stated outright. This attention was uncomfortable and maybe even unwanted. That discomfort seemed to center almost entirely around one name. Caitlin Clark wasn't just driving ratings, she was driving the conversation. Her games became events. Her highlights traveled far beyond traditional WNBA circles. And for the first time, a massive group of casual fans had a clear entry point into women's basketball. Instead of seeing that as a bridge, some voices treated it like a distortion. The concern wasn't about sustainability or long-term planning. It was about control, about the league's spotlight shifting in a way that didn't feel evenly distributed or carefully curated. What got lost in that criticism is a basic truth about how audiences form. fans don't arrive fully formed. They don't show up with encyclopedic knowledge and perfect appreciation for decades of context. They arrive curious. They arrive attached to one player, one moment, one story. That's how every sport grows. But during this stretch, curiosity was met with interrogation, interest was met with skepticism, and instead of pulling people deeper into the league, the loudest message many new fans heard was that their reason for watching wasn't valid enough. That's where the threat narrative took hold. Growth wasn't framed as a fragile momentum that needed guidance and care. It was framed as a flood that needed to be controlled. The fear wasn't that the league would disappear again. It was that it would change too much, too fast, in the wrong direction. And once that idea was aired on a national platform, it didn't just stay there. It signaled permission. Permission for others to say the quiet part out loud. Permission to push back against the very attention the league had waited years to receive. And that was the turning point. Because when growth is treated like a threat, fans don't feel like they've arrived at a party. They feel like they've interrupted one. And what happened after that would reveal just how costly that mindset really was. Once that idea was put into the air, it didn't stay isolated to one segment or one voice. It spread quietly, almost casually, through conversations across media panels, social feeds, and fan spaces. You could feel the shift. Instead of asking how to bring new viewers deeper into the sport, the conversation turned into questioning whether those viewers belonged there at all. The sudden popularity of the league wasn't being managed, it was being policed, and that's when the gatekeeping really began. New fans were immediately put on the defensive. They were mocked for not knowing league history, for not recognizing stars from seasons past, for showing up because of one player instead of 20. The implication was clear. Appreciation had to be earned, and curiosity wasn't enough. If you couldn't list champions, name past MVPs, or explain long-standing rivalries, your excitement didn't count. Instead of being welcomed into the community, people were made to feel like they had skipped steps they weren't allowed to skip. At the center of it all was again Caitlin Clark. Her role as the entry point for millions of viewers became a source of irritation rather than pride. Some longtime observers treated her popularity like it diminished everyone else, as if attention was a finite resource being unfairly hoarded. It wasn't just that she was getting coverage, it was that she was getting too much of it. And rather than seeing that spotlight as something that could lift the entire league, it was framed as something that needed to be resisted or corrected. What made the moment so damaging was how normalized this reaction became. When people pushed back and pointed out the obvious, that ratings were up, that arenas were packed, that women's basketball was finally leading conversations instead of chasing them, the response wasn't relief, it was deflection. The attention was labeled toxic, the fans were described as temporary, the momentum was treated like a problem that would reveal its downside sooner or later. Growth, instead of being nurtured, was put on trial. And here's the part nobody wanted to say out loud at the time. Gatekeeping doesn't protect culture, it freezes it. It sends a signal that the league values purity over expansion, loyalty over curiosity. For new fans, that message lands hard. When excitement is met with suspicion, people pull back. They stop engaging as openly. They stop arguing for the league. They stop defending it. The energy that could have been converted into long-term support starts leaking out before it ever settles in. This wasn't just a disagreement about coverage, it was a test of identity. Was the WNBA going to be a growing league that embraced new audiences as they arrived, or a guarded space where interest had to meet the right conditions to be accepted? That question never got answered directly, but the way new fans were treated gave them an answer anyway. And once that tone was set, the damage didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, quietly, and almost invisibly, right up until the numbers started telling a very different story. There was one part of this whole conversation that kept getting ignored, and it's the simplest part of all. Sports media doesn't operate on feelings, fairness, or tradition. It operates on attention.
Networks don't build coverage plans around what should matter. They build them around what people are actually watching. That's not a moral judgment. That's the business model. And once you understand that, a lot of the frustration surrounding the WNBA's sudden spotlight starts to look misplaced. Before Caitlin Clark entered the picture, women's basketball wasn't ignored because it lacked quality. It was ignored because it lacked reach. For years, the league had talented players, competitive games, and real storylines, but none of it consistently pulled a mainstream audience. That reality dictated where the WNBA landed in the media hierarchy. Short segments, limited discussion, rare debates, not out of disrespect, but out of demand. Networks simply weren't going to dedicate prime airtime to content that didn't bring viewers with it. That changed the moment the numbers changed. Once Clark entered and games started delivering ratings that couldn't be brushed aside, coverage followed immediately. Suddenly, the WNBA wasn't being squeezed in between topics, it was the topic. Shows like First Take didn't spend extended time on women's basketball because of a sudden shift in values. They did it because people were staying tuned in. That's how every sport earns relevance in the media ecosystem. Football dominates coverage because it delivers viewers. The NBA outpaces most global leagues because it commands attention. The WNBA, for the first time, had a player pulling that same lever. What made the backlash so strange is that this mechanism was treated like something unfair or manufactured, as if coverage was being handed out instead of earned. But star-driven attention isn't new, and it isn't unique to women's basketball. Leagues don't grow evenly. They grow through names, moments, and personalities that spark curiosity beyond the core audience. That curiosity is the entry point. Without it, even the best on-court product stays hidden in plain sight. Clark didn't replace existing interest, she unlocked interest that had never been captured before.
This is where the logic broke down for critics of the coverage boom. They wanted exposure without concentration, growth without a face attached to it. But that version of expansion has never existed in professional sports. Fans don't fall in love with abstractions. They connect to players. They follow storylines. And once they're in, then they branch out. That's the natural order. Expecting new fans to immediately distribute their attention evenly across the league ignores how fandom actually forms. Instead of recognizing this as an entry phase, the messy, uneven beginning of wider relevance, the attention was framed as a distortion that needed correcting. And that's where the reality check comes in. Coverage didn't create Clark's impact. Her impact created the coverage. The audience didn't follow the media followed the audience. Confusing that order led to frustration, resentment, and ultimately a fight against the very thing pushing the league forward. And what happened when that star-driven attention disappeared would expose just how dependent momentum had become on embracing that reality, not resisting it. The clearest way to find out whether momentum is real or borrowed is to test what happens when the main draw is removed, and that test arrived sooner than anyone expected. As the conversation shifted toward independence, sustainability, and proving that women's basketball could thrive without leaning on one central star, the opportunity seemed perfect. If the audience was truly there for the league itself, the numbers would hold. If the excitement had grown deep roots, it would carry over. What followed told a much different story. This is where Unrivaled, the new off-season league, quietly became a measuring stick. On paper, it had everything going for it: strong promotion, recognizable names, national broadcast partners, a narrative built around innovation and player empowerment. Reports suggested it would keep interest alive and prove that the WNBA's surge had unlocked a permanently larger audience. But once the games actually aired, early signals raised uncomfortable questions. Ratings reports indicated engagement that fell far short of expectations. For the level of exposure it received, the response was muted, and that gap couldn't be explained away by lack of talent or effort. The common mistake was assuming that excitement automatically transfers. It doesn't. Momentum has a source. In this case, a massive portion of new fans had entered the ecosystem through Caitlin Clark. When she wasn't part of the product, many of those viewers simply didn't feel anchored enough to stay. That wasn't a rejection of women's basketball. It was proof that the relationship was still forming.
Instead of acknowledging that reality and building bridges, the league and its surrounding voices seemed caught off guard by it. What made the moment even more revealing was how the explanation shifted. Rather than seeing the ratings dip as a sign that fan connections were fragile and needed nurturing, some framed it as confirmation that casual viewers were unreliable from the start. But that interpretation flips cause and effect. New fans didn't disappear because they were shallow. They disappeared because they were never fully welcomed or given a reason to deepen their attachment beyond one star. You can't scold people into loyalty. You have to invite them into it. This wasn't about proving that other players lacked value. It was about acknowledging that star power opens doors that haven't opened yet for everyone else. That's not an insult, it's a stage of growth. In every major sport, expansion begins unevenly and stabilizes over time as fans discover more stories to care about. The mistake here was acting like that early imbalance was a failure instead of a process. By treating the Clark-driven audience as something to move past rather than something to build upon, the league effectively let the doorway close before people had settled in. The momentum test didn't fail because women's basketball can't stand on its own. It failed because momentum was challenged before it was secured. And once that energy slipped, it didn't just affect one offseason league, it raised doubts across the entire ecosystem. Broadcast partners started asking harder questions, fans grew quieter, and the idea that the league could simply carry on as if nothing had changed began to look increasingly unrealistic. The real damage wasn't in the ratings themselves, it was in what those numbers revealed about how fragile goodwill becomes when it's pushed away instead of protected. While the frustration was boiling over and the blame was being passed around, one voice began striking a noticeably different tone. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, but it was unmistakably intentional. Rebecca Lobo didn't come out swinging at fans or lecturing them about what they should appreciate. Instead, she started doing something far more important. She acknowledged them. And in a moment where tension was building on each side, that shift mattered more than it seemed at the time. Rather than framing growth as a threat or an inconvenience, Lobo focused on context. She talked openly about what the league used to look like when she first played. Small venues, limited resources, minimal national attention, little financial stability. Then she contrasted that with where the WNBA stands today. Higher salaries, better facilities, improved travel, support systems that simply didn't exist for earlier generations. It wasn't a complaint, it was perspective. And for many fans watching from the outside, it was the first time someone in a prominent media role explained the full picture instead of arguing past them.
That approach became especially significant as labor discussions started spilling into the public conversation. Emotions were high, narratives were flying, and trust was fragile. When Lobo laid out details, housing support, childcare options, upgraded travel standards, long-term investment, it changed how a lot of people processed what they were hearing. The situation suddenly felt more complex than the simple good versus bad framing that had been circulating. Fans who had been pushed away by condescension felt pulled back in by clarity. Not because they agreed with everything, but because they finally felt respected enough to listen. The contrast with earlier messaging was impossible to ignore. While some voices leaned into frustration and defensiveness, Lobo leaned into communication. She didn't scold fans for not understanding, she filled in the gaps. She didn't frame interest as ignorance, she treated it as an opportunity to educate and build trust. That difference exposed just how much tone had mattered all along. The same facts land very differently depending on whether they're delivered as a lecture or as an explanation. Still, even this shift came with a quiet sense of urgency. There was an underlying recognition that the damage had already been done. Trust, once fractured, doesn't snap back into place overnight. Lobo's message felt less like a reset and more like damage control, an attempt to stabilize a relationship that had already started slipping. Fans could hear the effort, and many appreciated it, but appreciation doesn't always translate into immediate re-engagement. People who step back don't always rush forward just because the tone improves. That's what made this course correction so revealing. It showed what could have worked if it had come earlier.
It proved that meeting fans where they are isn't capitulation, it's strategy. And it highlighted the cost of waiting too long to change the message. By the time clarity replaced defensiveness, momentum had already thinned. The question was no longer how to grow faster, it was how to regain confidence that had quietly walked away. There's a moment in every fan relationship that doesn't get enough attention because it doesn't come with outrage or headlines. It comes with silence. That's when fans stop arguing back. They stop trying to explain why they care. They stop defending the league online. And eventually, they stop showing up. That shift happened slowly, but it happened decisively. The people who were once energized enough to debate coverage, ratings, and player impact didn't turn hostile, they disengaged. For months, new fans had been told, directly and indirectly, that their interest was suspect, that they were watching for the wrong reasons, that they didn't understand the league well enough to have an opinion. Over time, that message wears people down. Curiosity turns into self-consciousness, excitement turns into caution, and eventually, enthusiasm turns into distance. Fans don't leave because they're angry, they leave because they feel unwelcome. Once that feeling settles in, it doesn't matter how good the games are or how strong the narratives might be. The emotional connection has already been damaged. What followed was a quiet recalibration. Viewership dipped, engagement softened, the urgency that once surrounded every game faded, and in that vacuum, something unexpected happened. Public sentiment began tilting away from the voices that had pushed back against growth. Not because fans suddenly aligned with ownership or management, but because they no longer felt represented by the people speaking on behalf of the league. When fans sense that their presence is tolerated instead of valued, they stop identifying with the product altogether. This is how the conversation around labor tension shifted so dramatically. When disputes surfaced, many fans didn't rally the way some expected them to. Instead of immediate solidarity, there was skepticism. Questions replaced slogans. That wasn't apathy, it was detachment. A league that once felt like something fans were discovering together now felt like a space where their support came with conditions, and conditioned support rarely survives conflict.
The most telling part is that none of this happened with a single breaking moment. There was no mass announcement of fans leaving, no dramatic boycott. Just fewer people tuning in, fewer people arguing, fewer people caring enough to explain why they cared in the first place. That's the most dangerous outcome for any sport. You can recover from criticism, you can respond to controversy, but when people stop engaging altogether, rebuilding that connection becomes exponentially harder. And this is where everything circles back. The warnings about toxic attention and unreliable fans didn't predict what happened next, they helped cause it. By framing curiosity as a problem and enthusiasm as a threat, the league's surrounding voices created the very disengagement they feared. Once fans feel pushed out, they don't bang on the door trying to get back in, they move on. And the silence they leave behind speaks louder than any argument ever did. And that brings the conversation right back to the question everyone keeps circling without fully confronting. When momentum disappears this quickly, when a league goes from cultural buzz to uneasy silence in less than a year, does accountability matter? Or does everyone just move on and hope the audience forgets how it unfolded? Because the truth is, this didn't collapse in private. It happened in real time, in public, with millions of people watching the same shift play out. The comments that sparked this debate weren't made in a vacuum. Elle Duncan didn't invent the mindset, she articulated it. She gave voice to a discomfort that already existed around sudden popularity, around attention that arrived through a single breakout star instead of through slow, controlled growth. But once those words were said out loud, once growth itself was framed as something dangerous, they took on a life of their own. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, they land very differently than they did in the moment.
This isn't about demanding apologies for the sake of drama. It's about recognizing cause and effect. The league had something rare in its hands, a true bridge to the mainstream through Caitlin Clark. New fans weren't just showing up, they were bringing attention, money, relevance, and opportunity with them. Instead of being welcomed and guided deeper into the sport, many were made to feel like temporary guests who hadn't earned their seat at the table. Eventually, they believed it, and they left. What makes this especially hard to ignore now is the contrast in messaging that followed. When Rebecca Lobo began emphasizing communication, perspective, and inclusion, it highlighted what had been missing all along. Not better basketball, not better marketing, better trust. But trust is fragile. Once fans feel talked down to or dismissed, rebuilding that bond takes far more than a tonal shift. It takes time, and there's no guarantee those fans are still waiting. So does anyone owe anyone an apology? Many people would argue yes, not just for one comment, but for an attitude that treated the audience like a problem to manage instead of a relationship to build. Others will say the league can still recover, that this moment will pass. But one thing is no longer debatable. Growth doesn't happen on the league's terms. It happens on the audience's terms. And when a sport finally finds a way into the mainstream, burning that bridge, even unintentionally, is the most expensive mistake it can make. That's the part of this story that won't go away, not because it's loud, but because it's measurable. The numbers tell it, the silence tell it, and the fans who stopped arguing tell it best of all. Once people feel unwanted, they don't rush back, they move on. And whether the WNBA can rebuild that trust may end up defining its future far more than any breakout season ever could.